Why has it become impossible to advocate for Palestinian rights without facing accusations of anti-Semitism? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Jamie Stern-Weiner. Jamie Stern-Weiner is a doctoral candidate at the University of Oxford, where he researches the politics of anti-Semitism. His edited book on the Israel-Palestine conflict, Moment of Truth, was published by OR Books in 2018. His edited collection on anti-Semitism and the UK Labour Party is available as a free ebook from the Verso Books website. Jamie Stern-Weiner, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thanks for having me, Mouin.
So let's jump right in and begin with one of the main players in this entire issue, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, also known as the IRA. In a nutshell, what is it? Why is it such a main player in this issue? What is it about its definition of anti-Semitism that is dangerous and seems to be almost designed to undermine the promotion of Palestinian rights?
So I think with apologies to people who might already be familiar with this thing called the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, but I think it might help if we begin by just looking at the text itself.
Please do. I think that would be a great way to start.
Yeah, and if people want to have it up in front of them as we go through it, you can just Google IRA working definition of anti-Semitism and the webpage will come up. So the IRA definition itself, it comprises just 2 sentences. And the key bit reads, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Now, I think it doesn't take a rocket scientist to spot the problem here. If anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, that doesn't clarify what kind of perception that is. And if anti-Semitism may be expressed as hatred toward Jews, that also leaves open that it may be expressed in any number of other ways. So in other words, this so-called definition of anti-Semitism, it basically informs us anti-Semitism is some kind of a perception of Jews which may be expressed in some kind of a way. Very helpful. Thank you so much. I don't know how we survived until this definition came
And that
along.
passes for a definition.
Exactly. Now, there is a second element that often accompanies or is appended to the definition itself.
And these are examples of what could constitute anti-Semitism.
Exactly. A list of 11 statements, kinds of statements, which are potentially anti-Semitic. Why potentially? Because that list is prefaced with this caveat, which says that these could, taking into account the overall context, constitute anti-Semitism. Now, once again, I don't think we need to bother our friend the rocket scientist to figure out that there's an issue here. Any statement theoretically could be anti-Semitic. I mean, if I say to you now, Mouin, shout banana if you hate Jewish people, and you shout banana. So in that context, banana could be anti-Semitic. So the IRA text saying that these 11 kinds of statement could be anti-Semitic, that doesn't tell us anything. It all comes down to the context. Alas, the IRA text doesn't clarify what context ought to be considered qualifying. So just to recap, and then we can end our Talmudic analysis of this text. The IRA definition, it says anti-Semitism is some kind of a perception of Jews without clarifying what kind of perception that is. And then there's this list of examples of statements that could, depending on the context, be anti-Semitic, but they don't tell us what context should be qualified.
Give us some of those examples so we have a better understanding.
So, well, here's the thing. So the upshot of what I've said so far is this is a meaningless, this is a manifestly absurd text. And it's worth pointing that out because I can't tell you how many disquisitions and discourses, tracts and treatises have been written defending or critiquing this silly text. I said once, so I wrote once, never before have so many written so much about something so manifestly absurd. But that just raises the obvious question, which is, okay, so then why all the fuss? If this is clearly inadequate, then why on the one hand do you have the major pro-Israel organizations mobilizing their resources for years on end to kind of to further as a priority promotion of this definition across the world, and on the other
Promotion
hand,
of its adoption by governments and official agencies and the like.
exactly. And then on the other hand, why do you have the most senior governmental officials, senior European officials, like the European Commission Coordinator on Combating Anti-Semitism, Katarina von Schnellbein, and senior UN officials like High Commissioner Moretinos? Why do you have them standing up in public and publicly saying, in relation to this text, which anyone can see is absurd, publicly kind of humiliating themselves by saying that this text, this definition, is the most important, crucial, vital tool for combating anti-Semitism in the world? What's going on here? What's going on? Well, that brings us to what you asked about, which is the examples. So let's just look at them. There's 11 of them. 4 of them designate statements about the state of Israel. And collectively, those examples, the effect of them is to cast as anti-Semitic a broad swathe of legitimate, accurate criticism of Israel. So for our purposes, I think let's just look at the most obviously problematic of those examples. I think it's example 7 for those people who are following along. It says, applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Now, let's just put to one side for now this assertion that was smuggled into this supposedly neutral technical expert definition of anti-Semitism, that Israel, which has been occupying the Palestinian people for above half a century, no rights, is a democratic nation. Who's guilty of these double standards? According to Israel and its supporters, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the European Union, the United Nations, the International Criminal Court. As you know, Mouin, basically, literally every significant attempt to hold Israel accountable under international law and to universal human rights standards gets branded by Israel and its supporters as double standards.
So if you were to voice criticism or condemnation of Israel and not voice similar ones of Sweden or Ireland, then you are by definition anti-Semitic under this definition.
Precisely. And, it's very far from theoretical. In practice, this is what Israel and its supporters always do. So, for example, when Amnesty and Human Rights Watch recently published voluminous reports which found that Israel practices the crime of apartheid, what did Israel and its supporters do? They wheeled out these examples to accuse those groups of anti-Semitism, inter alia, because they supposedly were guilty of double standards. So that's why this manifestly absurd text is nevertheless both dangerous to supporters of human rights and valuable to Israel and its defenders, because those propagandistic pro-Israel examples, not the definition itself, Israel and its supporters, they couldn't care less about those meaningless 2 sentences, but those list of examples are in their hands a weapon to stigmatize and stifle criticism of Israel.
So You've, I think, made a persuasive case that this is an entirely absurd attempt to define anti-Semitism. Yet at the same time, we're talking about it because it has gained such broad international, including official currency. Maybe we can take a step back and you could explain to us how did this definition become, in effect, the preeminent instrument of identifying and denouncing what is claimed to be anti-Semitism.
So the deeper context here is that since the 1970s, Israel and certain pro-Israel Jewish organizations developed and popularized this notion of the new anti-Semitism. And basically, the idea there is that much or most international criticism of Israel should be understood as a form of anti-Semitism, whereas classical anti-Semitism was targeted against Jews as individuals or as communities. This new anti-Semitism targeted the same old animus, but in a new guise at the state of Israel as the Jewish state. Now, there's a former Israeli minister, Natan Sharansky, and he, or rather his speechwriter, Ron Dermer.
He was also head of the Jewish Agency for many years.
Exactly. And he and his speechwriter, Ron Dermer, they sort of condensed this whole body of writing around the new anti-Semitism into a catchy, pithy slogan, which he called the 3 Ds of anti-Semitism. What were the 3 Ds? It was that the new anti-Semitism comprised the delegitimization of Israel, i.e., claiming that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, or it doesn't have a right to exist as a Jewish state, whatever that means. We don't need to go into that. Delegitimization of Israel, demonization of Israel, by which was meant, in effect, accusations that Israel commits war crimes and human rights abuses, and applying double standards to Israel. Now, in 2004, against the backdrop of heightened international criticism of Israel during the Second Intifada, a handful of pro-Israel lobby groups drafted what they at the time called a redefinition of anti-Semitism.
These were mainly European groups or North American or a combination of the two?
It was a combination, but the principal actor was the American Jewish Committee. It was the principal drafter, and it was under its auspices that this drafting effort took place.
Which has a storied history as an anti-Zionist organization back in the day, ironically.
Yes, exactly. So they drafted this redefinition of anti-Semitism. Why redefinition? Because it included the new anti-Semitism. Now, they managed to persuade in 2005 this organization, which doesn't exist anymore. It was a body, an autonomous agency of the European Union. It was called the European Union Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, or the EUMC. They managed to persuade them to circulate on their website as a draft, unofficial text, this Israel lobby definition of anti-Semitism. Subsequently, various pro-Israel groups would use this text as a weapon against Palestine solidarity campaigners, calling for events to be cancelled and all of the usual good stuff. That caused controversy, and as a result, the Fundamental Rights Agency, or FRA, which was the successor body to this EUMC, so it's an agency of the European Union, it deleted that definition from its website in 2013. Now, when Israel and pro-Israel groups discovered that, they were outraged, and they determined to find a new institutional home for their anti-Semitism definition. And in 2016, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA, became the institutional home. And that's why we now refer to it as the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism.
And is IRA an official agency or is it an NGO?
So IRA is an intergovernmental body. At the time, in 2016, it had 31 member governments, mostly European governments, but also a few outside Europe, including Israel and the United States and Canada. It had been kind of a sleepy organization prior to 2016. Its main focus was on Holocaust remembrance, museums, and Holocaust education. It was basically a way to coordinate both at the political level and researchers at the civil society level around those issues. But in 2016, it was prevailed upon to adopt a working definition of anti-Semitism. Now, I would say from all this history, there's lots of things that are interesting to go into, but I would say there's two kind of key points that I would want listeners and viewers to sort of take with them as we continue with this conversation. The first is, it's not IRA's definition. This is the Israel lobby's definition of anti-Semitism. It was drafted
by IRA.
It was adopted by IRA. Well, we'll come back to that. There's a caveat to that. But it was drafted in 2004 by pro-Israel lobby groups. As I said, it was the American Jewish Committee that took the lead back then. And in 2016, the organization which engineered IRA's adoption was the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Now, these are both just reflexive pro-Israel advocacy organizations. And more to the point, both of them routinely, in the course of their pro-Israel advocacy, conflate legitimate criticism of Israel and campaigning for Palestinian rights with anti-Semitism. So this is the Israel lobby's definition of anti-Semitism. The second key point is, at every stage of this long diplomatic campaign, supporters of the definition have misrepresented its content and its scope. So I've already mentioned in passing two sort of examples of that misrepresentation, I think. So one was, I mentioned earlier that there was this caveat that the text placed before those long list of examples, which said that each example designated a statement that wasn't inherently anti-Semitic. It wasn't necessarily, but it could be depending on the context. Now that caveat, it wasn't in the original draft of the written by the Israel lobby groups. It seems to have been inserted at the last minute by worried EUMC officials who kind of wanted to limit the damage of what they were about to do. In practice, when Israel lobby groups have actually used this definition to stigmatize Palestine campaigners, Palestine rights campaigners as anti-Semitic, they just ignore that contextual caveat completely. It's just dropped. Secondly, I mentioned that the EUMC circulated the definition as an unofficial draft. Well, as soon as they did so, the pro-Israel group started to inflate its status. So it became the EUMC's definition. Then it became the EU definition. And we've seen the same thing with IRA. Like, it began with the IRA's, it was referred to as the IRA working definition. Then it just became the IRA definition. And now I see groups referring to it as the universal definition, the international definition. I don't know if it's the multi-universal definition too. Maybe that's the next stage.
I'm sure that's on the way.
Yeah. Now, the most, I suppose, politically significant misrepresentation, which it's worth just pausing a moment to note, concerns the status of these examples. As I mentioned, the actual definition is completely meaningless. No one cares about it. What Israel lobbyists value are these propagandistic pro-Israel examples. Now, in 2016, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, it came to IRA and it said, please adopt as your working definition of anti-Semitism both the meaningless two sentences and the list of examples. It wanted all the examples in the IRA definition. The problem is that some IRA member countries opposed the examples, especially it was the Scandinavian countries. Yeah, exactly. Their governments opposed those examples. And so they wouldn't agree.
Oppose the inclusion of those examples in the attempt to define anti-Semitism.
Exactly. And the thing is that IRA's decision-making body, it operates by consensus. So you need to get all of them to agree, and they wouldn't. So the examples were separated out from the definition. And it was only after and because the examples were excluded from the definition that IRA was able to adopt its working definition of anti-Semitism. Now, What happened then is from mid-2018, pro-Israel lobby groups, a number of kind of allied governments, and then even IRA's own permanent bureaucracy, its permanent office based in Berlin and mainly funded by Germany, maybe even totally funded by Germany, I'm not sure. They just rewrote history, and they just started claiming that in 2016, IRA's decision-making body adopted all of the examples as part of its definition.
Which was patently false.
It was patently false. Why does this matter? Well, partly, I just think it's not a good look for an organization whose mandate is the preservation of historical integrity, the integrity of the historical record in the service of human rights, to brazenly distort its own historical record in the service of enabling Israel's war crimes. It's not a good look. But second, each time this pro-IRA juggernaut, these lobby groups, target a new institution, pressuring it to adopt their definition, including the examples, that's how they frame it, they almost never defend the definition on its merits. How could they? It's manifestly absurd. Their main argument that they use is, look how many governments and bodies have already adopted it. It's the product of this broad, non-partisan consensus. They say, in that context, they say IRA operates by consensus. All governments had to agree to these examples being part of the definition, and it's just not true.
And the consensus can't be wrong.
Yes, exactly.
But isn't it also the case that some of the individuals involved in drafting this attempted definition have disavowed it, or at least claimed that it's been given much more weight than was intended, or have?
Yes, Kenneth Stern, who is an American Jewish researcher on anti-Semitism. He was for a long time the American Jewish Committee's head of anti-Semitism research. He, for a long time, was credited as the principal author of that definition. And he says he's the principal author of that definition. In subsequent years, he became a vocal critic, not of the definition itself, but of
the uses to which it has been put.
Precisely, of what he would describe as its abuse or its misuse as a tool to regulate speech, particularly on campuses within academia. He says it was never intended for that purpose, and it's been perverted by he says right-wing Jewish groups. I think it's very valuable that he has come out against that use of the definition for censorship. I don't think he's been fully forthright about the original aims that were motivating the definition. I think it was clearly always kind of had in mind that it would be used for those purposes. But it's certainly very helpful that he has spoken out against its political instrumentalization.
And has there been any significant pushback from any of the IRA member states?
No, that's the short answer. I mean, the interesting thing is, I mentioned that there's been this brazen misrepresentation of what those member countries agreed to. So you might think, well, especially those Scandinavian governments who objected.
Well, that's precisely why I asked, but your answer is no.
The answer is no. Internally, so I managed to get some records through FOI requests from IRA plenary meetings. Interestingly, not from the key 26 meeting. No one seems to be able to release those minutes, but from subsequent ones. And you can see internally, some delegations are expressing confusion about certain claims that they've seen being made about the status of these examples, and asking that it be made clear always in communications that those examples are not part of the definition. But they were just ignored. And then, they faced a choice, basically. Do we do we want to use our limited capital to take a stand on this issue? No. So they just let it go.
And the battle over this definition, if I understand correctly, has now moved to the United Nations, and there's a concerted campaign to persuade the UN to adopt it as an official, what would become a global definition of anti-Semitism. What is the state of play with respect to that?
So what's known is that, as you say, there is a clear campaign underway. There has been for many months now. Israel's ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, has been pushing it publicly and behind the scenes as well. UN High Commissioner Miguel Moretinos, who is the UN's point person on anti-Semitism, he has been working on a UN anti-Semitism action plan. And he has previously said in public that the UN needs to agree on a definition of anti-Semitism, and this definition should be based on the IRA working definition. Now, whether and when the trigger will be pulled in the form of a resolution endorsing the definition before the General Assembly is not clear. It will presumably depend on, the tactical judgments by the supporters of the definition. My guess is that if and when the resolution is tabled, it won't explicitly say the UN endorses the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, including all the examples. That's not how these groups work. It's more subtle than that. Probably, I would guess, it would be something like this. You'll get the UN General Assembly resolution, possibly tabled by Israel and Sweden. This will endorse the Moretinos action plan on anti-Semitism, leaving it ambiguous as to how it understands that plan's reference to the IRA definition.
A process very similar to IRA's own adoption of this document.
Exactly. And then Moretinos himself, I guess, this action plan, it will reference the IRA definition, but it won't make clear whether or not this includes the examples. And through that
this is the same Miguel Moretinos, a Spanish official who was, as the EU Special Envoy to what was mislabeled the peace process in the 90s, was effectively one of the main enablers of the consolidation of Israeli rule in the occupied territories.
The very same.
Mm-hmm.
He, was it 2 years ago now, or maybe 1 year, but he had a meeting with Gilad Erdan, following which Erdan briefed to the Jerusalem Post and others that Moretinos has agreed to support the IRA definition. And then every time anyone mentioned this Jerusalem Post article, Moretinos then would get very angry and say, it's not true, you shouldn't believe everything you read in the press, and so on. And then it turns out he has said the UN needs to adopt a definition and it should be based on the IRA definition.
So just playing devil's advocate here, assuming this continues to play out, how would you respond, for example, to the assertion that this is the way it should develop, because while you single out pro-Israel lobby groups, effectively, in reality, most Jews, regardless of their political affiliations or regardless of their views on Israel, endorse this definition of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so this is one of the main arguments that has been used to defend the definition, notably by European Commissioner von Schnurbein. She points to this poll that was conducted of Jews across the EU, and she argues that based on those poll results, it can be shown that what the IRA definition defines as anti-Semitism accords with what most Jews consider to be anti-Semitism. I'd say a couple of things in response to that. And she calls that a victims-led approach. We need to listen to the victims. Firstly, it's a highly selective victims-led approach. It's the first thing to say about it. One might even call it a double standard. I mean, if most Iranians or most Russians were polled and they were asked, do you consider the EU sanctions targeting your countries to be Islamophobic or Russophobic? And if a majority said yes, would the EU then declare its own sanctions policies as Islamophobic or Russophobic? Obviously not. In fact, it's so uninterested in that line of thought that it for sure won't even poll Russians and Iranians on the question. Second, the same opinion poll that von Schnurbein cites of Jews living across the European Union, it finds that some 40% of Jews consider any criticism of Israel to be anti-Semitic. And in Spain, that figure rose to above 60%. So now, in the name of a victims-led approach, does this mean that when the EU criticizes Israel's settlements, that criticism is anti-Semitic? And does it mean that the Spanish government should now dissociate itself in the name of fighting anti-Semitism from any and all EU statements criticizing Israel? The basic point is every community views the world through, or is liable to view the world through, partisan lenses. That's why serious attempts to craft this kind of regulation, they don't defer to interested parties, but they employ experts working to technical and objective standards.
How about the argument that the IRA definition is meant to combat anti-Semitism and as such doesn't threaten free speech unless that speech is explicitly anti-Semitic and endangers the well-being of its of those it is intended to protect?
So people who say that the definition poses no threat to free speech, they mainly point to two aspects of the definition, which they present as robust safeguards against its misuse. The first is that the definition, it says, I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but it says basically criticism of Israel that's similar to criticism of any other country can't be considered anti-Semitic. That's just another way. It's just a reformulation of the double standards example. And it's subject to the same criticism that I made of that example. It's completely in the eye of the beholder as to what constitutes the same criticism. Defenders will also point to the fact that the IRA definition is not legally binding. Now, a couple of things to say about that. First, as with the it depends on the context caveat, that wasn't in the Israel Lobby Group's original text. That was a safeguard that was secured, I think, by Denmark during the IRA deliberations. More importantly, the definition doesn't have to itself be legally codified in order to influence how hate speech laws are applied. It can still, if judges, when they apply hate speech legislation, factor into account and are influenced by IRA's definition of anti-Semitism, then that definition can indirectly control how the law is applied. And in fact, the European Commission's own IRA handbook cites as an example of best practice, referencing the definition in legislation and using it to train judges and police officers. So clearly, they're envisaging it having an influence on how the law is applied. Finally, look, these lobby groups have sought to get this definition adopted and entrenched and institutionalized across civil society, the full length and breadth. Universities, political parties, football clubs, airline carriers, social media platforms. Now, when such organizations adopt the definition and subsequently come under pressure to take action against anti-Semitism by whatever it may be, moderating content online or excluding party members or sanctioning university students or whatever it may be, then insofar as they understand anti-Semitism in terms of the IRA definition, then individuals are going to be sanctioned or excluded and so on for breaching the IRA's terms. And that's not theoretical. It already happens to some extent. There's been examples in the UK, like in 2013, a number of universities cancelled Israel Apartheid Week events, supposedly because they breached the definition. What was striking about it was that, I think I got the year wrong. I think it was in 2016. 2017. It was in 2017. What was striking about that incident was that when those universities shut down student events, political events, preemptively, on the grounds that they would breach this IRA definition, or rather the IRA examples, the Simon Wiesenthal Center cited that as a great example of the use of the IRA definition. And in fact, also Katharina von Schnurbein has cited that as an example of IRA best practice.
So much for free speech.
So much for free speech, exactly.
And how would you respond to the broader point that you can't effectively fight anti-Semitism if you don't define it?
So, this is a mantra that is repeated by all of IRA's supporters, and it is catchy, but when you think about it, some very odd conclusions immediately leap to the mind. So firstly, the implication would seem to be that before this definition came along in 2005, it was impossible to combat anti-Semitism. So what was the Anti-Defamation League doing for all those decades after World War II? What was the AJC doing for all those decades after World War II? This was the period when, by most accounts, or the period which, by most accounts, saw the greatest decline in anti-Jewish discrimination. And somehow this was accomplished without a definition. Another implication would seem to be that today it's impossible for governments and for the European Union and so on to do anything to fight Islamophobia or anti-Black racism or other kinds of racism or prejudice, none of which have been defined by those institutions in equivalent terms. The third point to say is, although Ms. von Schnurbein claims that her advocacy of this definition is evidence-based, no evidence has ever been presented to the effect that if you adopt this IRA definition, the levels of anti-Semitism will decline. None. And then finally, even if one does accept, which I don't, but even if one does accept that you do need a definition of some kind for some purposes, why this one? Why this clearly absurd definition? I think a couple of illustrations are kind of illuminating as they expose as false this idea that the impetus for this definition came from those on the front lines fighting anti-Semitism who needed a tool in order to aid them in their work. Consider, years after the EUMC first circulated in 2005, the Israel Lobby's anti-Semitism definition, the text's main drafter, it was Kenneth Stern, who we mentioned before, he was moved to publicly complain that even Jewish organizations weren't using it. Then, in 2008, the Fundamental Rights Agency, this body that succeeded the EUMC, it reported that it had sent out this draft definition to its network of racist incident monitors for feedback, and it had found that they considered the definition unhelpful and they weren't using it. Then here's the most revealing episode, which I only learned about recently. We know about it because of internal documents that this very good Israeli reporter called Itai Mashiach obtained through an FOI request. So when the German government was considering adopting the IRA definition, it asked internally for the assessment of its technical departments, those responsible for prosecuting anti-Semitism, about the definition. And all those technical departments, I think they were in the Interior Ministry, they said, the definition is unhelpful. It actively makes our job harder. We don't need it. They only agreed, those technical departments, to the German cabinet's endorsement of the IRA definition after the wording of that endorsement was changed so as to render it purely symbolic, purely political. In other words, it wouldn't interfere with their actual work in identifying and prosecuting anti-Semitism. Now, of course, once the German government did endorse the definition, pro-Israel groups then tried their best to make sure that it wasn't merely symbolic. That's how this works.
More by way of conclusion, are there any broader lessons to be learned from what is, of course, an ongoing process, but are there broader lessons to be learned here, whether about effectively combating racism, about censorship, about freedom of speech, about getting governments and international agencies involved in seeking to define and police these issues?
I think so. I think it's been interesting to see in the wake of the IRA definitions formulation and successful propagation, a whole raft of other definitions have been floated. So we've had a working definition of Hindu phobia. We've had a working definition of Islamophobia. None of these have gained much traction as of yet. All of them are animated by a political agenda that's no more subtle than the one animating the IRA definition. I think this whole approach is mistaken. What the IRA definition shows, I think, is that when it comes to phenomena like anti-Semitism, there's no way to define it without either except in terms that are either so concrete and partial as to be politically arbitrary, or else in terms that are so vague, for example, by having to depend on the overall context, as to chill speech. So what I think is, it is true that one needs to have some kind of operative understanding of anti-Semitism if you're going to have hate speech laws. In my view, that the difficulties inherent in producing such an operative understanding of anti-Semitism or any other set of attitudes is a powerful argument against hate speech legislation. If you're determined to have hate speech legislation, then at least you should define what constitutes hate speech in terms that are broad and non-partisan, non-sectarian, and certainly not going into this laundry list of particular statements that this or that group doesn't like.
Jamie Stern-Weiner, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and very detailed knowledge of this issue with Connections. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.